In the summer of 1993, a group of Ukrainian tourists were kayaking down the Snezhnaya River in southern Siberia. It was supposed to be a peaceful expedition through the wilderness, but as they rounded a bend, they saw something standing on the riverbank. It was a teenage girl. She was motionless. Her clothes were tattered. Her face was a mask of terror, and she was staring blankly at the water. She looked hollow. When the tourist paddled over to her, she didn't speak. She couldn't. For 4 days, she had been wandering alone through one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth. Her name was Valentina Udochenko. She was 17 years old, and she was the sole survivor of a hiking group that had, just days earlier, consisted of 7 people. When she finally regained her voice, she told police a story that defied medical science. She didn't speak of an avalanche. She didn't speak of a bear attack. She said her friends didn't just die. She said they went insane. Lyudmila Korovina was not your average hiking guide. She was a master of the wilderness, a master of sports in the Soviet hiking classification system. She was tough, experienced, and deeply respected. But she was also known for her extreme philosophy. Lyudmila believed in survival of the fittest. She often trained her students by deliberately depriving them of food and comfort, pushing their bodies to the metabolic breaking point to teach them grit. For this trip, a grade 4 difficulty hike through the Khamar Daban mountain range, she had picked 6 of her best students. They were young, fit, and loyal. There was Alexander Sasha Krisen, whom Lyudmila loved like her own son. There was Tatiana Filippenko, 24, Denis Shvatskin, 19, Victoria Zalenskova, 16, and Timur Bapanov, 15. And finally, Valentina Udochenko, 17. They were not amateurs. They were a disciplined unit, and as they set off into the mountains on August 2nd, the weather was clear. They were singing songs. They were happy. They had no idea they were walking into a biological trap. For the first 2 days, the hike went according to plan. But on August 4th, as they ascended the Translator Peak, the Siberian weather turned violent. A massive cyclone slammed into the mountain range. Rain turned to sleet. Sleet turned to heavy, wet snow. The temperature plummeted. Here is where the first mystery lies. The group was exhausted. Instead of descending to the tree line, where there was shelter and wood for a fire, Lyudmila made a baffling decision. She ordered the group to set up camp right there, on the completely exposed, treeless face of the mountain. They had no fire. They had wet sleeping bags, and all around them the wind howled. Valentina later recalled that they ate a cold breakfast the next morning. They were freezing, but they were calm. They packed up their gear to leave, until suddenly Sasha fell. It happened in seconds. One moment, 23-year-old Sasha was putting on his backpack. The next, he collapsed to his knees, screaming. Valentina described a rapid onset of catastrophic symptoms. Sasha became began foaming at the mouth. Blood began to pour from his ears and eyes. This was not hypothermia. Hypothermia makes you lethargic. It makes you sleepy. Sasha was exhibiting signs of a potent neurotoxin or a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Panic erupted. The remaining students were watching their leader and their strongest member dying in the snow, bleeding from their facial orifices. Tatiana, one of the girls, ran to the rocks to find shelter, but before she made it, she grabbed her throat. She began tearing at her own clothes, a phenomenon known as paradoxal undressing, yes, but accompanied by a psychotic break. Valentina watched in horror as Tatiana began bashing her own head against a jagged rock. She didn't stop until she fell silent. Victoria and Timur went next. They ran. They vomited blood. They tore at their own skin. In less than 20 minutes, 6 fit, healthy hikers lay dead or dying in a small circle on the mountainside. Valentina was the only one left standing. She checked pulses. No one responded. She was alone on a frozen mountain, surrounded by the bodies of her friends, with no idea what invisible force had just killed them. And that is where her true nightmare began. Valentina Udochenko did something extraordinary. Panic is the enemy of survival, yet surrounded by madness, she remained rational. She knew she couldn't carry the bodies. She took a sleeping bag and a small ration of food from the tent, and she ran. She descended the mountain to the tree line, where the group should have camped the night before. She spent that first night alone in the dark, listening to the storm that had just claimed her entire world. The next morning, she made a grim decision. She climbed back up to the site. She had to be sure. When she reached the camp, nothing had moved. Her friends were exactly where they had fallen, now partially buried in snow. The silence was absolute. She took a map and a compass from the bodies, said a final goodbye, and turned south towards the river. Valentina didn't just leave, she fought. According to her statement, she tried to drag her friend Victoria towards the tree line, away from the exposure of the ridge. But in her delirium, Victoria fought back. Valentina told investigators, "She bit me. She wouldn't move. She was screaming." That was the breaking point. Realizing she couldn't save them, and that staying meant joining them, Valentina made the impossible choice to run. She followed the power lines down the valley. For 4 days, she existed in a fugue state. She later described an oppressive silence, not peaceful, but heavy. She survived by burrowing into the snow at night like an animal to insulate herself from the wind. When the Ukrainian kayakers finally saw her on the banks of the Shnosnaya River, she wasn't waving. She was screaming. One rescuer recalled she was covered in dried blood, not her own. For hours she couldn't speak. She just pointed back up the mountain. Valentina was rescued, but it would be weeks before a recovery team could reach the body. Weeks. The weather remained so hostile that helicopters couldn't land until August, nearly a month after the incident. What the recovery team found was a scene of devastation. The bodies were in a state of advanced decomposition. Ludmila, the leader, was found lying on top of Sasha, as if trying to shield him or keep him warm in her final moments. The others were scattered, some shoeless, some only in light underwear, despite the freezing temperatures. They were airlifted to Ulan-Ude for autopsy, and this is where the medical mystery deepens. The official cause of death for all 6 hikers was listed as hypothermia. Pathologists noted signs of protein deficiency in their organs, likely a result of Ludmila's extreme starvation training methods. Their bodies had no energy reserves to fight the cold. But this diagnosis fails to explain the acute onset of symptoms Valentina witnessed. Hypothermia causes a slow shutting down of metabolic processes. It does not typically cause hemolacria, bleeding from the eyes, or frothing at the mouth. Furthermore, the autopsy noted bruised lungs and signs of cardiac arrest in Sasha. Were these symptoms of the cold, or were they signs of something toxic? Okay, the official autopsy claims the hikers died from hypothermia, complicated by protein deficiency due to their lean diet. But as any medical professional will tell you, that diagnosis is garbage. I'm a nurse. I've seen hypothermia. I've seen malnutrition. Here is what they don't do. They don't cause you to bleed from the eyes. They don't cause instantaneous foaming at the mouth. And they certainly don't cause a healthy 23-year-old male to collapse and die in minutes. Sasha's symptoms, the frothing, the bleeding, mimic a rapid onset of pulmonary edema or the effects of a neurotoxin. You see this in chemical warfare, not in starving hikers. To label this malnutrition isn't just a mistake. I smell a cover-up. The theories. Theory 1. Infrasound. The wind conditions on the ridge that night were extreme. Physics tells us that when high winds hit the specific geometry of a mountain ridge, it can create a Kármán vortex street, generating low-frequency sound waves called infrasound. Infrasound is inaudible to the human ear, but it vibrates the eyeballs and internal organs. Studies have shown it can induce panic, terror, and even visual hallucinations. Did the wind literally drive them mad, causing them to flee the shelter of the tent and succumb to the cold? Theory 2. Aerosolized toxin. Sasha's bleeding and foaming mouth mimic the effects of a potent nerve agent or blistering gas. The Khamar Daban range is vast and remote, perfect for covert military testing. If the wind carried a toxic cloud over the ridge, it would explain why they died one by one, and why Valentina, who was slightly further away or upwind at the critical moment, survived just long enough to escape the plume. Theory 3. Psychological cascade. This is perhaps the most tragic theory. Sasha was Ludmila's favorite student. When he collapsed, perhaps from a heart attack induced by the cold and starvation, Ludmila broke. Seeing their invincible leader panic and die caused a collective psychological breakdown in the starvation-weakened students. They stopped thinking clearly. They stopped fighting for warmth. They simply gave up. If this story feels familiar, it should. 34 years earlier, further north in the Urals, 9 hikers cut their way out of a tent and died in the snow. The Dyatlov Pass incident. The parallels are haunting. Both groups were led by master outdoorsmen. Both groups experienced a sudden, inexplicable panic that caused them to abandon their gear, and in both cases, the authorities were quick to blame the natural force of the weather. But there is one chilling difference. At Dyatlov, an unknown force crushed their chests. At Khamar Daban, an unknown agent destroyed them from the inside out. 2 mysteries, 1 frozen silence. Before we close the file on the Khamar Daban, we need to remember that this isn't just a mystery. It isn't just a ghost story to tell in the dark. These were friends. They were sons, daughters, and students, with their whole lives ahead of them. Ludmila Korovina, Alexander Sasha Krisen, Tatiana Filipenko, Denis Shvachkin, Valentina Valya Udochenko, Victoria Zalaskova, Timur Babanov. They loved the mountains. They loved the adventure. And in the end, they stayed together. To the families who still feel this loss, and to Valentina, who carried the burden of survival, we tell this story not to exploit your tragedy, but to ensure that the world never forgets their names. May they find the peace in the next life that the mountain denied them in this one. If you have a theory on what caused the bleeding eyes, leave it in the comments below. I'm April, and this is Mysteriophiles. Stay creepy.